Hi, good afternoon, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started. Yeah, okay. Well, welcome to the Adaptation Community Meeting. For those of you who have not joined us before, the Adaptation Community Meeting happens on the third Thursday of the month. It's a chance for adaptation and development practitioners to come together and share research and projects and network, which is a great opportunity. So we're happy to have you here. USAID hosts the event, and we do that in partnership with the ATLAS project, the Adaptation, Thought Leadership, and Assessments project, and that's implemented by Chemonics. So thanks to Chemonics for hosting us. We have our in-person participation here, and then we also have several folks joining us online. So please keep that in mind, and we'll look forward to hearing from the webinar participants as well. Just as a quick reminder, the next ACM is on October 18th. The topic will be posted on climatelinks.org shortly, so please be sure to check back there. And also, we always ask if you ever have an idea for an ACM or would like to present, please go on to climatelinks.org and follow the instructions to submit a topic or an abstract. We have a very exciting afternoon planned for the next hour, hour and a half. We will hear from, I'll introduce our speakers shortly, we'll hear from them. And then we really want to have an open and active conversation with you, our audience, both in here and online, and really get a dialogue going back and forth. Often the ACM can kind of be a question and answer type, ping pong type of effect, and we really do want to engage and have a nice dialogue this afternoon. So please feel free to jot down questions as the speakers are talking, and we can be sure to address them as a group. So hopefully you're all aware that today's topic for the ACM is climate resilient infrastructure. The global investment need for infrastructure, as a reminder, is $94 trillion by 2040 in order to keep up with economic and population growth projections. But at current rates, we are only on track to meet 18% of that need. So that's 18% of $94 trillion. And at the same time, as I'm sure we're all aware here, climate impacts like floods and heat waves and droughts and other both short-term and long-term impacts are compromising existing infrastructure and then making it much more challenging to design new infrastructure because of the uncertain weather and climate conditions that we're trying to make decisions under. 2017 was a record-setting year. Global losses from weather-related disasters totaled $320 billion. That was the costliest year ever. As a climate and development community, I think we all know that the need is very great, and yet the risks are high. And so this afternoon, we'll aim to address some of the challenging questions that we're facing as we try to address this need. Like, what is keeping us from making smarter decisions about the way we design and develop and finance infrastructure? And what practical steps can we take, both in a 5-10-year time frame and then in the next month, 2 months? And our panelists will help explore some of those questions. USAID is addressing this infrastructure challenge at hand, both here in Washington and through our missions in the field around the world. And we work with our partner countries to help them build their own capacity to be more prepared for disasters and to become more resilient to climate shocks and stresses. And this type of support ultimately helps the countries we work with along their pathway towards self-reliance so that disaster assistance may not be needed or could be reduced over time. So some of the challenges that we hope to address today with our panelists through a discussion of project examples from the field. We'll look at really understanding the complexity of the problem of designing, developing, and financing climate resilient infrastructure. It's just as important to think of creative and innovative solutions as it is to really grasp and understand the basics of the problem and how complex it can be. We'll discuss what some of the barriers are that take us or that challenge us to bring some of those solutions to scale, and how to really tailor them to the specific geography and context. And then we'll also touch on what kind of various funding sources are needed to be leveraged in order to support those investments. So with that, I will introduce our speakers who will help us think through these challenges and hopefully inspire us with some solutions. And we look to the audience as well to contribute to that discussion. We have, and I'll present in order. So Doug Mason is the Director of Environmental and Social Performance at the Millennium Challenge Corporation. Next, we have Chris Perrine, who's the Chief of Party on the Atlas Project. John Pash, who's Chief Engineer with USAID's Office of Infrastructure and Infrastructure and Energy. And then Sam Houston from the Washington Party, the Chief of Party on that project. And I won't read through all their bios. You can, if they weren't printed out front, you can find them in the calendar invite, just in the interest of time, and they will convey their expertise and background through their talks. So with that, I'll pass it off to Doug.
Do I need the microphone, or am I going to be loud enough without?
I think for the webinar, you do need the mic.
All right, I'll try to two-handed. So this is Typhoon Haiyan. This was one of the strongest storms ever to make landfall. It had sustained winds of about 190 miles an hour. And it's a little hard to see in this NOAA image, but it's barreling toward the Philippines here. And I wanted to start with this to make, I guess, 2 points. One is, it turns out that where I work, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, we had just built a 220-kilometer road that went, sorry, didn't realize it was a touch screen. right about here going down, basically right where the eye was going. So one simple message is, if you work on development, you've probably got something in harm's way. So we have like protecting the taxpayers' dollars. We want to make sure that that road didn't get washed away, because the benefits of what would wash away with the road. So that's one thing. The much greater point, obviously, is there's a much bigger challenge in the Philippines or just in Asia. To build on your point, Asia needs about $1.7 trillion of investment in infrastructure just in developing Asia each year till 2030. Just building that much infrastructure is a challenge. But building it in a way that's going to be sustained so that it's resilient is an even greater challenge, because we can't build it the way we've always been building it. That we need new ways of doing better. And so mostly what I want to do today is kind of incite some debate about what that might mean. How do we go to scale? Because again, it's not just about one road here, it's about the Philippines, it's about Asia. In this particular case, this is what the road looked like before the storm. So we knew a priori that this is a risky area. The Philippines is known for a long time that typhoons come barreling through here, so it's not a surprise. We also knew they were getting more intense. So they did look at climate models, and they did work with the government of the Philippines that was trying to nationally upgrade their standards. And they did the kinds of things you might expect. The return periods, the estimated interval between when bad storms occur, they were traditionally every 20 years, and we thought, well, we should at least go to one in every 50 years. But of course, how often these things happen is also changing. I mean, Houston's a good example, right? What do they have, like 3 500-year storms in as many years? So there's also a change in just how quickly these storms are showing up. And these things matter, as John can attest, being an actual engineer, is that you want to design the system to be able to withstand that intense amount of rain, or mostly water in this case. So what they did was they upgraded the culverts to make them larger, so they had more hydraulic capacity. They raised the bridges. We built 60 bridges that total about 3 kilometers overall. So a lot of bridges, raising them up above what you would normally do. Did things like strengthen the embankments and raise the seawalls. Did we know that we were making the right decisions, that was just high enough? No, we didn't, and that'll come back to that. Did we think it was better than not going beyond the local standard? Well, that was our bet. It was our insurance policy. This is what the road looked like after the storm. Now, there's a lot of debris, as you can see, and there's parts of the Philippines that look far worse, for those of you that have seen the pictures. So it required a lot of cleaning up, but the road was still there. A few places it did get overtopped by landslides, but during the emergency response, it served the function as a critical corridor for personnel moving in and out and attending to people. And then after the recovery period was over, it was still able to serve its function of spurring economic development. So in this particular case, people were thinking about it. They did their best case, estimates of what to do, and it happened to work out. But that's one project, right? Well, good for that road. But if the other road coming in here that connects with this road is washed out, well, then all those people living over there, not so much. So what we need is resilient systems, not just individual roads. So even when we get it right once, that's still not good enough. So my question to all of you is, how do we go to scale? And I don't have the answer, but this is a debate that we're hoping to incite. I think part of the answer is we need to come up with some ideas about how we do things differently. I mean, for everyone that goes back to their desk and says, how can I do better tomorrow compared to what I did like maybe a year ago? How do we answer that question? The answers could vary, but we think there might be some principles. And so we're trying to generate some discussion around this. I'm going to cite just one example of what I think is a principle about how we do better, and I'm hoping that you will provide your thoughts on what you think those principles should be when we can have more back and forth. So I think one of them is that we need to make better decisions in the face of uncertainty. A traditional way of engineering is it's like, just tell me what the peak rainfall for 24 hours is, or tell me whatever the parameter that matters most is, and the engineers can engineer to that. So that's a traditional way of doing things. Building codes sometimes capture that. But unfortunately, with things changing, that approach doesn't work. I'm going to cite one example that we've been doing with the Army Corps of Engineers about flipping that question around. So step one, this is a water treatment plant in Zambia. So the first thing to do is, well, what is this sensitive to? What about climate or changing extreme weathers matters? In this particular case, it is drought. Not for the reasons you might think. It's not drought that will not provide enough water here. It's drought because this plant depends on electricity. The electricity for this plant comes from hydro. If there's drought, there's no hydroelectricity. This plant can't purify anything. So once you've done that, then you do this. This is a quick example of robust decision making. So the bottom axis here is rain, and that's what the climate variable that we think matters. The x-axis is outages. Outages we care about because when that happens, you don't get purified water. So the 0 here, when you're under the precipitation, just means like no change. This is percent change. So that means status quo. -1 means 1% drier, -2, 2% drier, etc. And then these, again, as you go up here, you're just getting a greater and greater likelihood of outages. Now, those red dots, those are different climate futures. These are the outcomes of various models that are produced. Now, again, the engineer might say, okay, tell me which of these futures is the one that's going to happen, and I will build you the infrastructure that's resilient to that. Is it this one? Or is it that one? Or maybe it's this one. And the fact is, while we see patterns, we don't know. So what we've been doing with the Corps' assistance is saying, well, maybe we need to think about this differently. And this is how. Basically, even if you don't even think about any of these things, just building your project the way you always would have, without any worry about this, there are some futures that you're probably already just resilient to. They're probably the futures that are pretty close to today. 0 means no change. So you could build your project like this, and you're already, there's certain futures which you're good. I mean, you're done. You're fine. Problem is, maybe not. So the question you would ask is, okay, this is my base project. Am I willing to make a little bit of an incremental investment? You know, maybe it's raising the bridges a little bit. Maybe it's increasing culverts on a road. That would then make my project more resilient to a greater variety of possible climate futures, these additional red dots. If the answer to that, and then if you're an engineer, you can figure out how much that would cost, you know, what it would cost to do that engineering solution. Then the question for the developer or the person making a decision is, are you willing to make that investment? Does it make sense to do this additional investment? If the answer is no, it doesn't make sense, well, then you go back to your base model, and this is what you've got. If the answer is, yeah, it does make sense, let's do this additional investment, then you say, great, now we've got a project that is now resilient to all of these possible futures. Are you willing to make an additional investment that would make it resilient to these other ones that are more extreme, more different from what we experience today? At some point, you get to the answer where you say, no, that's as far as we can go. Because, again, budgets are limiting, and things get more expensive usually, you know, as you go up this chain. So at some point, you'll get to say, no, we're not willing to do this now, and then you have your answer. You're going to engineer to this set of climate futures. These are the ones you're resilient to. A corollary of this, too, is if you can build in flexibility, that really helps. For example, in the project I was showing you, you know, one way to make sure you've got power is just to have pads where you can have electrical generation in the future if you needed it. Maybe it's not worth investing in the generators today, but leaving some space, you know, so that later, if you needed to put in a portable generator, there's room. long story short is we propose that one way of working toward more resilient development is maybe new ways of thinking about how we manage uncertainty, because there is some uncertainty. And this would be one principle that could help us make more resilient decisions, but we need a lot more. So that is the debate I wanted to discuss, and comments are certainly welcome today or as a follow-up.
Thanks, Doug. If you have a quick clarifying question, please make a note of it, and just to continue the flow, we'll move on to the next speaker, but there are index cards being passed around, and so if you just want to jot down a quick question to remember it, we can come back to it at the conclusion of the panelists.
All right. Thanks, Doug. That was great. Very thought-provoking. Okay. Again, for those who didn't catch it the first time, Chris Breen, I'm the Atlas COP. I'm going to focus my presentation on a particular piece of work that Atlas did last year, and this was doing a climate vulnerability assessment in Jamaica. And just very quickly, for those who may not know exactly what a climate vulnerability assessment is, essentially it is an assessment to determine the specific vulnerabilities that are imposed by climate and a changing climate. And you might focus on a particular geography, you might focus on a particular population, you might focus on a particular economic sector or sectors. In this case, we were focusing on the transport sector in Jamaica. And again, a little bit more background for those who don't know. I mean, Jamaica is an island. It's in the Caribbean. It's a subtropical climate, and so it has some of the problems that, and advantages that you would expect from a country in that situation. So just very quickly, these are the things I'm going to focus on in my presentation. I'm going to go over the objective of our assessment, a little bit on the methodology we used, cover some of the climate issues that are specific to the Jamaican transport sector, recommendations that came from our assessment, and then some observations of mine that some are directly relevant to the assessment we did in Jamaica, but some are sort of thinking out further about getting at some of the core issues that Danielle mentioned in her intro about what do we do to kind of advance the ball and deal with what is, a pretty monumental challenge going forward. Okay, so in the Jamaica case, we were asked to do this assessment because it is a priority both for USAID in Jamaica, but also for the Jamaican government. They are revising their transport sector policy, and that covers, all forms of transport in Jamaica. And this is part of a larger Vision 2030 process that Jamaica has gone through, where they're trying to essentially modernize and integrate the way that they manage the country and the economy across all sectors and all ministries, et cetera. So the priorities for our assessment obviously were to identify vulnerabilities in the transport sector that would be useful to the Jamaican government in terms of updating their transport sector policy. But also we wanted to develop a methodology that could be used by the Jamaican government going forward to both update the information that we're providing, or that we provided, but also to do other assessments, to drill down and do specific assessments of particular facilities or other things. And then to offer recommendations, for how they could integrate, the vulnerabilities that we had identified into their revised policy. Okay, so the methodology that we used, I'll just say at the outset, it was primarily quantitative, meaning based on data. We looked at other vulnerability information that had been developed by others. There are some listed there. The World Bank had done a good study. Some others had as well. And then we obviously looked at historical weather data, rainfall and temperature, and combining that information, both which was all secondary information, I should say, with some satellite imagery, and from that information we built maps which show the specific vulnerabilities in particular areas, and to some degree, a limited degree of particular facilities. We did not have the mandate or frankly the time or resources to really drill down and look at specific facilities, but we were able to provide enough information that it would allow the Jamaican government to prioritize in terms of vulnerability of particular facilities, and then to do a deeper dive on those to come up with a plan to make them more climate resilient. In addition to the quantitative part, we also did consult with stakeholders in Jamaica, government officials, some in the private sector, et cetera. As I say, we then mapped the vulnerabilities and we made recommendations for how they could improve climate resilience in the transport sector. So just a quick review of what some of the climate stressors are in Jamaica. They're not ones you would not, they are ones that you would probably expect. Heat exposure, flooding, sea level rise. I won't go into too much detail here, but obviously all of these have implications for the transport sector. You have coastal roads that are a problem in floods and obviously are susceptible to sea level rise. You have their main international airport, which is in a low-lying area very near the coast and quite susceptible to flooding. So there are quite a few vulnerabilities across the transport sector and to particular facilities. And for anyone who doesn't know, because I didn't know, atmospheric condition. This graph on the right side there is just showing in response to extreme weather events, what percentage, different categories of things that have occurred in terms of extreme weather events. And atmospheric conditions refers to wind and dust. And I don't know why that is or where that came from, but that's what it is. Okay. Our recommendations, and the map on the left, this is just something I pulled from the report, and that's specifically Norman Manley International Airport, which is the main international airport in Jamaica. And though you can't see it too well from there, the little red squares show areas that are, the darker ones show 1 meter or less above sea level, and the lighter ones 2 meters or less above sea level. And so they've got some issues there. Our recommendations fall basically into 2 buckets: one governance, one information systems, and you can see what they are there. I mean, basically, we're suggesting updating of a lot of the planning documents and policies, and revising infrastructure design standards, getting to one of the things that Doug brought up, to take into consideration climate risk. And then also the last thing on the page there, conduct facility-specific climate vulnerability assessments. They definitely need to do that for some of their key facilities. For the international airport, for example, for their main port facility, for some of their more important main roads. Okay. A few observations before I wrap up here. Data is really important, and as I mentioned at the outset, our assessment was based primarily on quantitative data. I do think that that's really important, particularly, again, getting at the the challenge that we face going forward, which is essentially financing a massive amount of infrastructure that needs to be built out to be more climate resilient. Qualitative assessment, particularly in the climate area, I think is useful, but I think it is useful only either A, as a complement to quantitative data assessment, a quantitative assessment, or as sort of a first step before you get to doing a more in-depth quantitative assessment. You know, I mean, for example, if you're looking to go to a fund like the Green Climate Fund, or you're going to the private sector looking for financing, you've got to have data, or you're just not going to, you're just not likely to get the response you're looking for. The other thing is that you know, a quantitative assessment, I just personally think has a lot more credibility. It's much more likely to change minds, to change behavior, and to get people set sort of on the right road to addressing the challenge that we face. So I think I'm out of time, so I'm going to stop.
Thanks. So once again, I'm John Pash. I'm in the Energy and Infrastructure Office of USAID here in Washington, engineer. And before I start, I just have to tell one quick story. So I was actually in Tacloban in the Philippines about 2 weeks after the hurricane, and I remember seeing the destruction that you showed everywhere in the town. And we were driving around doing our site assessments, and I remember driving over to one bridge that survived, and they drove us across the bridge, and we get across the bridge, and there's this amazing road sitting there, and I remember thinking, gosh, I hope this is a USAID road. And I looked at the guy who was driving us along, and I was like, USAID? And he's like, MCC. And I was like, out-engineered again. So anyway, so we've heard about the depth of the problem. It's tremendous, and I think we're all development professionals here, or at least I assume we are, but we're in the business of development too. And I think I will just reaffirm with my presentation that infrastructure, building things, is fundamental to development in some way. And in many ways, what USAID does, we don't really build infrastructure for the sake of building infrastructure. We build infrastructure to support other things. So a lot of what we think about on the engineering side of aid is how do we keep going and get all this safety and protection and passing on good practices and making sure we have resilient infrastructure, but keep going, because what we're doing is contributing to other development objectives. So I'm going to actually finish Chris's presentation. Thank you. And then start mine. Sorry. And just start by trying to debunk the myth that USAID doesn't build anything, because I hear this a lot. So just as way of background, we do about $2 billion of construction activities a year. And you may think a lot of that is in Afghanistan and Pakistan and places like that, and you'd be right. But about half of that is actually other places and in a lot of small mechanisms. I think about half of our construction activities are under $1 million. And again, supporting basically all development objectives. I think we have construction in every single operating unit, including Washington operating units. We're doing construction everywhere. So we're building things all the time, moving forward. We do it under different mechanisms, under assistance, under contracts, through G2G mechanisms. And then we do a lot of different stuff. So we do buildings, we do water, we do some transportation, even some IT type of infrastructure overall. So, sorry, just looking back and forth. I wanted to talk a little bit about how we think about risk. As we're moving forward, our opportunity as a development organization to really influence the management of risk around activities, whether it's climate risk or the environmental risk or just project implementation risk, is in the planning stages. So we really front load our risk management, the way we think about adaptation in projects, the way we think about developing a good project that's going to upgrade the infrastructure, create real infrastructure, is through planning process at the beginning. And these are often, or most often, they're given to us by policy or protected by policy. So we have a climate risk management policy, we have a construction risk management policy, and we like to believe that we can plan. If we plan well, if we identify what we're doing early, we generally come out with a good project. One of the key elements of construction activities now as part of our policy is to engage an external engineering firm. I know it sounds basic and simple, but it actually is very effective because I think our other speakers have said, you know, engineers typically, if you give them a point off in the distance and tell me design to that, they will design to that. But we have to have the data as well. So the challenges we have really is that most often we don't have any data. Or we have very limited data. So we're not able to, you know, have the level of vulnerability assessment that sort of Chris described. And so how do we move forward when we don't have data? How do we move forward when we have building codes and zoning regulations, international codes that we don't know how they're being applied, or we don't even know if they're adequate for the situation that we're working in. So, and ultimately, how are we balancing you know, the idea of climate proofing something with the constructability of it in a given country and the cost of that. I mean, when you talked about how do we deal with uncertainty, I think in the U.S. how we deal with uncertainty often is we throw money at something. I mean, I'm being a bit crass, but money will get you out of a lot of uncertainty. We don't have that option when working in developing countries and small-scale programs, and we have to think a little bit differently. You know, we can't overbuild something and expect that that's going to be the model for scaling up a piece of infrastructure overseas. So how do we move forward? I think generally, you know, we tend to take the most conservative design approach we can, and what I mean by that is that if you have your 500-year flood, let's just call that a flood that's going to happen. We look at risk factors and you know, increased factors of safety. We have trouble predicting the future, so can we use factors of safety and basically worst-case design scenarios. So if something's happened, it's probably going to happen again. It's a little out of the norm for engineers who like to design to something in particular with a certain probability, but we can do worst-case designs. Again, cool. Okay, great. Okay. So the other thing I think we've learned recently is that using green building techniques is actually a really great way to introduce climate resilient infrastructure into something that is relatively inexpensive, and it ends up resulting in something we've built that I think our recipients see value in what's been built, and we can adapt it to local conditions. So being opportunistic with those green building elements, and I'm going to give an example of that from Pakistan, and making sure that what we're doing is really locally appropriate. So we can't introduce technologies that aren't going to work in a given country. So, and then lastly, I think we've had to be very realistic with time span, and this is a bit controversial, but I think to a certain extent the engineering world is changing to think of infrastructure, some construction activities being a bit disposable over a certain time span, but they're not going to last forever. We're not designing buildings really anymore to be there forever. It's just the reality of the way we're working. So, I mean, switching that perspective is pretty important. All right, so I've talked in sort of the abstract. I wanted to talk about a very specific case. I just got back from Pakistan and looking at this program, which has been in implementation for several years now. So we have a basic education program in Sindh. Karachi is sort of the capital of Sindh. There's 100+ schools we're building there. They're basic kind of, I think, secondary schools, but they're fairly simple buildings. The area of Jacobabad has temperatures above 130 degrees Fahrenheit fairly regularly at certain times of year, and there are areas that are extremely flood prone. During, I believe, in an early phase of this project, they suffered some great floods down there. So how do the standard design that the government of Pakistan gives us is a pretty standard brick building, and I think we recognize that it wasn't dealing well with conditions for students in the building based on temperatures which continue to go up. And then many of the sites that we had been given to work with were flood prone. So essentially introducing some basic green building techniques, we were able to increase ceiling height all relatively inexpensively. So the rooms now have higher ceilings, change the insulation material to be a little bit higher standard than what they were using before, so a little bit more insulated building, have an optimum building orientation so the sun is not, baking the students inside, and then increasing window openings. All this was simple, and the big message overall is I think the Ministry of Education in Pakistan recognized this is something they can totally do. It's within their code overall, and they can adapt this across the country. So getting to scale, this is where we found we're most successful, is when we can demonstrate something fairly simple based on a design that that is consistent with local codes, that improves the infrastructure that a country or a region has, that we often have success getting this adopted across the entire sector. So lastly, on the flood mitigation, fairly simple and also relatively inexpensive. We just elevated the sites, physically elevated them above, the flood that had come through before, and then did that to the maximum level so that it was above their maximum flood they had. I'm going to rush through that. Okay, I'm going to hand it over to Sam. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sam Houston. I'm the Chief of Party for the USAID WashFin project. WashFin focuses on finance for the water and sanitation sector, primarily focused on urban areas. So for most of my statements, you can be thinking of kind of working with water utilities on sanitation and the water side. So in terms of the challenge, the World Bank estimates that to meet universal access for water and sanitation, that $114 billion a year is going to be required. That's 3 times current investment levels, and that doesn't include the cost of maintaining existing infrastructure, reinforcing new or existing infrastructure, and or thinking about how to deal with additional costs potentially posed by climate change. So the WashFin approach is an all of the above approach. It's going to require significant public investment, but we also think that crowding in private investment is going to be absolutely required to close the financing gap in the space. So our approach is around providing technical assistance, and we're currently active in Senegal, South Africa, Kenya, Cambodia, Nepal, and we'll soon be starting up in the Philippines. So underpinning our approach to thinking about climate change adaptation challenges and infrastructure finance, we've come up with some principles that underpin our approach and our thinking. So the first is that climate change is likely to have impact on financial viability and the longevity of infrastructure investments. Secondly, understanding and planning for climate change risk to infrastructure reduces service delivery interruptions. Additionally, climate and water availability risks need to be accounted for in the day-to-day utility business plans, and this is where we focus a lot of our time and effort. So infrastructure investment decisions are usually once in a 30-year decision, but a business plan governs how a utility thinks on a day-to-day basis, and that's where we think it's most appropriate to get thinking about climate change on everyone's radar as part of their day-to-day responsibilities. The next principle is around integrating analysis of climate and other risk factors. It can reduce costs, it can improve operating revenues, and can extend asset lives. And the final principle is adaptation options effectively integrated into operating plans, strengthen creditworthiness of utilities, and that opens up more options on the financing side. So a few examples of day-to-day things that we're engaging with in our technical assistance programs across our portfolio. So in South Africa, we've been active in Cape Town, which is just coming out of a massive water crisis. It's raining in Cape Town now, which everyone's very thankful for, but we're helping the city to review designs they have for wastewater reuse to complement the limited water sources that they have now. We're working with the Development Bank of Southern Africa on some very large-scale programs to reduce water losses in Pretoria, and we're working with a variety of development stakeholders to think through what types of thinking needs to be incorporated in investment planning to deal with increasing water scarcity in South Africa. It's probably no surprise that in South Africa everyone gets it, and everyone's thinking about climate change quite a lot. In some other countries, that's maybe not the case. In Nepal, where we're working with some secondary towns. A lot of our work there focuses on sanitation activities where current infrastructure has been sited in floodplains and is increasingly dealing with flooding challenges. So we're helping municipalities think through standard operating procedures to help mitigate the impacts of flooding and thinking through how they can make sure that their future investments incorporate climate thinking in their designs. In Cambodia, we're working with private water operators in secondary towns as well to think about switching over to solar pumping. There's significant efficiency gains and mitigation benefits from financing clean energy sources. And we're also working with those same PWOs to think about how they can look at making investments in water intakes that are more resilient in terms of dealing with both the flooding side and the drought side. In Cambodia, it's typical that surface water is used. It's often surface water that is coming in and out of rice paddies and quite susceptible to the effects of climate change. So thinking through opportunities to look at mixing up water sources in terms of groundwater and surface water is part of what we're helping the private water operators think through. In Kenya, we're working with the regulatory agency at the national level to revise their business plans to bring in climate change thinking into their approach, and we're working on supporting a variety of efficiency and performance improvement type investments at secondary town level, which we think are going to help make water service providers in Kenya more resilient. A few final thoughts about climate change adaptation based on our experience implementing so far. Many water utilities aren't keeping up with demand from rapidly growing cities without even considering the impacts of climate change. But what's clear is that poorly managed and non-credit-worthy utilities are certainly lacking the resilience and adaptive capacity to deal with the growing risks of climate change. On the flip side of that, the failure to adequately integrate climate risks into business utility plans can pose serious financial risks. The priority needs to be on maintaining, protecting, and optimizing existing infrastructure, but only well-managed and efficiently run utilities are in a position to do that in a resilient manner. And finally, it's absolutely critically important that all future investment is done in a way that's climate smart and allows utilities to manage their operations from a systems engineering approach that provides some flexibility and flexibility in terms of the types of service provisions that's going to be provided with growing uncertainty on the climate side. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you. Thank you all for your presentations. Just to quickly recap so that we can get a good conversation going, we heard from Doug. Doug questioned, oh, I thought you were pointing. Doug questioned how we traditionally approach engineering and asked us to think about new ways of thinking about decision-making under uncertainty, looking at under various climate scenarios, how we can improve the investments that we make and build in flexibility. And he also talked about the need for resilient systems, not just a single piece here and there of resilient infrastructure. Chris described the process of the climate change vulnerability assessment to assess climate risks and identify options for reducing vulnerabilities, working specifically with the government hand in hand and incorporating those proposed actions into their transport sector policy. And he emphasized the use of quantitative information and the need for that climate data to inform our decision making. And it also helps change behavior, justifies our investments, and helps to prioritize them. And then we heard from John, our real engineer, about USAID's approach to construction risk management and emphasized that if we plan well, we'll get good results. He talked about the importance of green building codes as a technique to integrate climate resilience into the work that we're doing, and also the importance of locally driven solutions. And lastly, you tried to answer one of the questions that we'll hopefully address, which is how do we bring all this to scale? And so using simple techniques that can be replicated and incorporated into policy can help do that, just like you said, raising elevation or improving insulation. And then lastly, we heard from Sam about the finance piece, which is critical. He discussed WashFin's approach to mobilizing finance for climate-resilient infrastructure in terms of physical assets, and then the financial investments, what does that look like? He talked about the importance of long-term planning and utility business plans, so it's an integrated approach that looks well out into the future in terms of operations and maintenance, and highlighted 4 examples in South Africa, Nepal, Cambodia, and Kenya. So with that as a recap, to remind everyone of the presentations, I have a laundry list of questions that I'd like to ask, but I feel like I've done enough talking and would love to hear from the audience. If you have some questions or comments, particularly in response to some of the questions that were posed. How do we scale up our climate resilient infrastructure? How do we pay for it? I'll put that out there. Comments and questions both welcomed.